Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind that usually drifts by unnoticed. The sun was stretching lazily across my kitchen table, casting golden rectangles of light over the half-folded laundry I hadn't finished yet. I had just brewed myself a cup of chamomile tea, something I'd started doing ever since my doctor warned me about caffeine and blood pressure. Life at 58 had slowed down in ways I hadn't expected. My children were grown, my husband passed 6 years ago, and though I had friends and family nearby, the days often felt longer than they needed to be. That's when the knock came. Not the hurried rapping of a delivery driver or the familiar rhythm of my neighbor Janice, who always popped by unannounced. This was softer, uncertain. When I opened the door, I blinked for a moment, surprised to see Ryan, my cousin's son, standing there, backpack slung over one shoulder and an unsure smile tugging at his lips. "Aunt Leela," he said, calling me by the title he always had, though we weren't technically close enough for it. "Hey, do you have a minute?" Ryan was 23 now, tall and lean with that boyish awkwardness that still clung to him like it hadn't quite decided to let go. I hadn't seen him in months. Last I'd heard, he was working part-time and taking online college courses, trying to find his direction like most young men that age. His eyes, the same soft brown as his mother's, held something I couldn't quite place. Not distress, not exactly. More like a quiet need. I stepped aside, motioning him in. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in, sit down. You look like you could use something cold to drink." He gave a small nod, brushing past me with a polite thank you, his eyes scanning the familiar space like it had changed since his last visit. I poured him a glass of iced tea and slid it across the table. "So, what brings you by?" I asked, settling in across from him. He hesitated. His hand circled the glass but didn't lift it. I didn't really know who else to talk to. You were always good at listening, you know." That surprised me. Ryan was quiet at family gatherings, more likely to be found helping with the dishes than mingling with his cousins. But I nodded gently, giving him space. He exhaled. "I've been feeling kind of stuck lately. Work's going nowhere, school feels pointless some days, and I keep thinking I should be doing something different, but I don't even know what that is." I could feel his words settle in the air, heavy but familiar. I'd heard similar from my own son once, though he never said it quite so plainly. I leaned forward, resting my hands around my teacup. "That's not unusual, Ryan," I said softly. "You're not supposed to have everything figured out yet. Nobody really does, no matter how old they get. But it helps to talk about it." He looked up at me then, his eyes meeting mine fully for the first time. There was something vulnerable in them, something that made my heart soften. I could see a boy still looking for approval in a world that constantly asked for answers. We talked for a while. About his job, about a girl who had broken his heart, about the pressure to make something of himself. I listened, nodded, offered thoughts when he asked, but mostly I just let him speak. At one point, he leaned back, laughing a little. "I didn't think I'd say all this out loud. It's kind of weird. Feels like I'm rambling." "You're not," I said. "You're doing exactly what you need to do." There was a lull, the kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. Just two people sitting with shared air and unspoken understanding. The room felt warmer, closer. Ryan stood then, walked over to the window, hands in his pockets. "I always liked this house," he said. "It felt like a safe place, even when I was little." That comment struck me more deeply than I expected. I had tried to keep this house that way. For my kids, for myself, for anyone who needed it. He turned back toward me. Would it be okay if I came by sometimes, just to talk? I think it helps. I smiled, genuinely and without hesitation. Of course, Ryan. You're welcome any time. It was around that moment that something shifted. He sat back down, but this time closer. Not too close, but enough that I could feel the change. There was no trace of romantic intent, nothing inappropriate, just an unspoken comfort. A young man who felt safe, and a woman who realized how much she missed being needed. He told me a story about his high school years, about something his father never quite understood. I listened closely, occasionally laughing at the small, awkward bits he clearly hadn't meant to say. His voice grew more relaxed, warmer. He looked at me differently now, not as someone older or just family, but as someone who saw him completely. And in that moment, I felt seen too. The sky outside had turned a soft shade of purple, and neither of us had noticed the time pass. I stood up to draw the curtains, and he helped, reaching past me slightly, his arm brushing mine. It was innocent, a touch without intention, but I felt it. The warmth of his skin, the closeness. He paused beside me, and for a brief second, we looked at each other. Something hung in the air, not desire, but recognition. Two people from different places in life, sharing a space that neither of us had expected to be so honest, so grounding. I should probably head out, he said, voice low. I nodded, walking him to the door. I'm glad you came, Ryan. Truly. He turned as he stepped outside, the porch light catching the side of his face. Me too. I didn't think I'd find anything like this today. And then he left. I stood there in the doorway for a long moment, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the doorframe, heart full but unsettled. Something had begun that afternoon, though I didn't yet know where it might lead. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for it to end. The next day, I found myself listening for another knock, and when it came again, sooner than I expected, I opened the door a little faster. He came back 3 days later. I had just returned from the grocery store, setting down a bag of apples when I heard the now familiar knock. My heart responded before my mind did, lifting just a little in my chest, as if it had been hoping for this without admitting it. When I opened the door, Ryan stood there, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, eyes searching mine, like he wasn't sure if he'd overstayed an invisible welcome. I wasn't sure if it was too soon, he said with a sheepish smile. It's not, I replied, stepping aside. You're just in time. I was about to make lunch. Something about the way he walked in felt different this time. Less hesitant, more comfortable. He slipped off his shoes at the door without being asked, glanced around like he belonged here, and followed me into the kitchen. I started slicing tomatoes while he leaned on the counter, watching with the kind of attention that made me aware of my movements. I missed this, he said after a beat. What? My amateur cooking? No. He smiled. This. The quiet. You. I didn't answer right away. His words were soft, but they lingered. I handed him a plate and gestured toward the table. We sat down like we'd done it 100 times before, sharing a simple meal, exchanging thoughts about nothing and everything. His courses, my garden, the Negra's runaway cat. Yet beneath it all, a current hummed, quiet but insistent. After lunch, we moved to the living room. He slouched into the couch like a kid again, and I sank into the armchair across from him. The sunlight stretched lazily across the rug, and the house seemed to sigh into the calm. I told my mom I saw you, he said after a while. Oh? She was glad, said you always had a calming presence, I think I forgot how true that was. I smiled, but something about his tone made me curious. Is she worried about you? Maybe, but I think it's more that she wants me to feel connected. Like, I have a lifeline. I watched him, this young man sitting there with one leg tucked under the other, his brows furrowed in thought. There was something in the way he spoke now, a quiet openness that felt like trust. He looked over at me. Can I ask you something kind of personal? You can ask me anything. He hesitated, then asked, what was it like when Uncle Henry passed? I blinked, surprised by the sudden turn. My husband's name felt like a soft echo in the room. I hadn't spoken about him in months. It was lonely, I said, more than I expected. People think grief is loud, sobbing, anger, long nights. But for me, it was the silence that hurt most. The sound of a house that didn't breathe with someone else in it. He nodded slowly. I think I'm afraid of that, of being alone like that. The vulnerability in his voice made my throat tighten. Ryan, you're not alone, even when it feels like it. He stood up and walked over to the bookshelf, running his fingers along the old spines. Then, turning around, he asked quietly, did you ever feel like you wanted someone again? After. It was a question that caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it struck at something I hadn't spoken aloud, not even to myself. I looked at him, standing there in my living room, his face open and searching, and I nodded. Yes, I whispered, but it's complicated. At my age, the heart doesn't just want passion. It wants safety, respect, familiarity, things that don't come easily. He stepped closer, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. I think that's what I want too. We stood there for a long beat, our eyes locked. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even physical. It was human. Deep. Two people who had somehow become mirrors for each other's quiet ache. Eventually, I reached out and touched his arm, just lightly. I think you're braver than you realize, Ryan. Most people never say these things out loud. He looked down at my hand on his arm, then back at me. I think I say them because I know you'll understand. The words sat between us like an unspoken agreement, tender and fragile. Later, when he left, he hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory kind, but one that lingered just long enough to stir something in me I hadn't felt in years. Not longing, not desire, just the unmistakable warmth of being needed, of being held. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed. The silence of the house felt different now. Not empty, just waiting. Waiting for what? I wasn't entirely sure. But I knew I would answer the door again, every time he knocked. The following week unfolded in gentle waves. Ryan began stopping by more regularly, never uninvited, never for too long, always with a soft knock and a question that hung just behind his eyes. Is it okay if I'm here again? And every time I welcomed him in without hesitation. Our rhythm became natural, almost domestic. Sometimes he brought snacks, other times I had leftovers from whatever I'd made the night before. He'd help me carry laundry upstairs or water the plants on the porch. We didn't always talk about heavy things. Sometimes we just watched old black and white movies or listened to music while he lounged on the carpet, arms behind his head, eyes on the ceiling, like he was letting himself breathe for the first time all week. One afternoon, as I was folding towels in the laundry room, I heard his voice from the doorway. "You always smell like lavender in here," he said with a small grin. I glanced over my shoulder. "It's the fabric softener." "Still, it smells like calm." I laughed. You sure it's not just the boring scent of middle-aged life? He walked in and leaned against the doorframe. If this is what middle-aged life smells like, I'll take it. There was a quiet between us again, the kind I'd come to expect when he was thinking about something deeper. He stepped forward slowly, took one of the folded towels from the basket, and ran his hand across it. I've been having these weird dreams lately, he said. Not nightmares. More like moments that feel too real. Ones where I'm sitting somewhere safe, and you're there, not saying anything. Just there. I didn't know what to say at first. His honesty was disarming. There was no performance in it, no hidden meaning. Just a young man's truth, raw and unfiltered. I placed another towel on the stack and turned to face him fully. Maybe your mind's just trying to remind you that you're not as alone as you feel. He studied me for a second, then nodded. Maybe, but it's more than that. It's not just about feeling alone. It's about wanting to be understood, wanting someone to see all the messy parts and not turn away. I knew that feeling too well. Ryan, that's not something age fixes, I told him. Even at 58, I have those thoughts, that maybe no one really knows the whole of me. Not anymore. Do you want someone too? He asked. His question didn't feel intrusive. It felt sincere, curious in a way that reached right past the usual barriers we throw up out of habit. I paused before answering. I think I do, I said slowly, but I've gotten used to being a little invisible. It's easier to carry the weight when no one asks what it feels like. He looked at me with something like quiet reverence. But I do want to know. I think I've always wondered what your life was really like. I remember visiting when I was a kid and feeling like this house had secrets. Not dark ones, just personal things. I smiled. It does. I have drawers full of old journals, a box of letters Henry wrote me when we were dating, a few pictures I never put up because they made the house feel too sad. His eyes softened. Can I see some of them? The journals? I hesitated. I hadn't opened them in years. Those pages were filled with the most private parts of my younger self, naive thoughts, quiet heartbreaks, little victories I never shared with anyone. But something in Ryan's request didn't feel invasive. It felt honoring. I nodded, motioning him to follow me upstairs. We sat on the floor of my bedroom, something I hadn't done in years. I opened a cedar box from under the bed and handed him a journal, the cover worn and faded. He turned the pages slowly, carefully, like it was an ancient text. Every so often, he'd glance up at me, smiling at a funny entry or raising an eyebrow at one of my old hopes. You used to write about running away to Paris, he said. You even made a list of cafes you wanted to visit. I chuckled. That dream faded quickly once I had 2 kids and a mortgage. But you still could, he said, more seriously than I expected. You still have time. The idea seemed ridiculous on the surface, but the way he said it, like he genuinely believed it, planted something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. He set the journal down and looked around the room. You've made a life here, haven't you? I tried. I said, sometimes I wonder if I settled, or if this is just what growing up really looks like. He stood and crossed the room slowly, his hand brushing over the top of my dresser. I don't think you settled. I think you gave and gave, and you still do. There was something so sincere in the way he said it, my eyes stung unexpectedly. I turned my head away for a moment, trying to catch my breath. Why are you being so gentle with me? I asked softly. He paused, then said something I hadn't expected. "Because you're the first person who made me feel safe enough to be gentle too." That stayed with me. Long after he went home that night, I kept replaying it. I didn't know if we were drifting into something dangerous, or if we were simply two people finding comfort in each other's presence. Maybe both. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt needed. The next morning, I found a note tucked under a coffee mug he'd used. In his handwriting, messy but familiar, he'd written, "Thank you for seeing me. For really seeing me." And below that, "I want to know all your stories, if you'll keep sharing them." I held the note to my chest, closed my eyes, and let myself feel whatever this was becoming. For the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel invisible, and that changed everything. A week passed before I saw him again. It wasn't like the other times. Steady, frequent visits that stitched a gentle routine into my life. This time there was space, a quiet pause that made me wonder if something had changed, or if he'd simply drifted back into the tides of his own world. I didn't want to be the one to reach out. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure what I had become to him. A confidant? A friend? Something more complicated? Then, on a soft, rainy afternoon, there he was again. No warning. Just a knock, slightly firmer this time, like he was sure I'd open it. He stood on the porch with wet hair and damp sleeves, holding a grocery bag in one hand. "I brought dinner," he said, lifting the bag and smiling. I stepped back without a word and let him in. He moved through the kitchen like he'd always belonged, setting things down, pulling open drawers, peeling garlic like he'd done it here for years. I watched him, silent, my heart trying to find a pace that matched the moment. When I finally spoke, it came out quieter than I intended. "I thought maybe you were done coming around." He looked over at me and set the knife down. "I thought about staying away. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to make things harder for you." "Hurt me, you mean?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah." I walked to the table and sat down, letting the silence fill the space between us again. I'd come to understand that the quiet was where we said the most. But this time, it was thick with unspoken meaning. "I've been thinking about what this is," I said finally. He turned, resting his back against the counter. "Me too." "And?" I asked. "And I don't think either of us planned for it. But it's real, whatever it is. I feel more grounded here than anywhere else." He stepped closer but didn't sit, his eyes meeting mine. "You don't treat me like I'm broken. Everyone else is either trying to fix me or push me forward like I'm behind on some timeline. But you let me just be, and I didn't know how much I needed that." I felt my throat tighten. "You've given me something too. Something I didn't know I missed until it was right in front of me." He sat across from me then, his hands resting on the table. The rain outside made a soft rhythm against the windows, a soundtrack to our unfolding honesty. "I know the world wouldn't understand this," he said. "The age difference, the whatever this is between us." "No," I agreed. "They probably wouldn't. But I also know that what we have is built on something real. Not impulse, not confusion, just understanding." He reached across the table, palm up, inviting. I didn't hesitate. I placed my hand in his, and for a moment, the storm outside disappeared. We ate dinner slowly, without much conversation. There was no need to narrate what was happening. Our gestures spoke for us, the way he refilled my glass without asking, the way I laid my hand on his arm when he looked away too long, lost in thought. Everything was delicate, but not fragile. Later, we sat on the couch again, but this time closer. The space between us had shrunk without either of us acknowledging it. His shoulder brushed mine lightly, and neither of us moved away. He turned to me. "Can I ask something?" "Always." "If this was anyone else, would you have let it happen?" I took a long breath before answering. "I don't think it ever could have happened with anyone else. You didn't come into my life trying to fill a hole. You just showed up. And little by little, you brought me back to myself." He smiled, slow and thoughtful. "That's how I feel too." And then came the moment I knew would happen eventually, the moment his hand brushed my cheek and lingered. Not with expectation, not with pressure, just a quiet connection asking to be seen. I didn't pull away. I let the moment unfold, soft and slow. We didn't cross any lines that couldn't be uncrossed. We didn't tumble into something reckless or irreversible. What we did instead was hold each other. On that couch in the dim light, wrapped in a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. His arms around me, mine around him. We spoke in quiet murmurs, memories, fears, little hopes. When he fell asleep with his head resting lightly against my shoulder, I didn't move. I stayed still, heart full, eyes damp, but not with sadness. I realized in that moment that the world didn't need to understand us. What mattered was that we did. That we found something. Unexpected, yes, but honest. Healing, human. As the storm passed and the room darkened further, I knew life would go on. People would come and go. Seasons would change. But I had this chapter, this strange and beautiful chapter, where two people found refuge in one another. And sometimes that's more than enough.